I would like to start my presentation on Moluccans in the Netherlands, a temporary stay. During the months of February, May 1951, approximately 3,500 Moluccan, mainly ex-KNIL soldiers and their families, left Tanjung Priok to the Netherlands for a temporary stay for 3 to 6 months, it was believed. A total of 12 transports brought about 12,500 Moluccans to the Netherlands, men, women, and children. After arriving in the port of Rotterdam or Amsterdam, the people were transferred in buses to a transit camp in the center of the Netherlands. And from there on, they were spread out to one of the many Ambonese camps in the Netherlands. There, they waited for a more peaceful political situation and their return to Indonesia, to the Moluccas. Well, today we have 2021, 70 years after the first arrival. The Moluccans still reside in the Netherlands. Recent research estimates the Moluccan community today at about 70,000 people. About the entire first generation deceased is gone. And we are currently speaking of a fifth generation of Moluccans in the Netherlands. Well, what I would like to tell you is about the reason why the group of Moluccans came to the Netherlands in 51, who they are, and that's part one. And the second part, what happened to them since. Many of you most likely have heard of Moluccans in the Netherlands. For some of you, it may be an unknown or faraway history, but there's more of a shared past with you in Surabaya, for instance, than you might think. For instance, there is Om Joop Kaichili from Surabaya who came to the Netherlands with the group Moluccans in 51 as a young stowaway. He got married and he built up his life in the Netherlands, and he went back on vacation to his to the neighborhood where he where he grew up, Kalungan Tiga. Then there's another person I would like to introduce. This is Om Anis Patiasina. He also grew up in Surabaya, and in 1945 and 46, he was a member of Pesindo Maluku in Surabaya, and he was involved in the liberation of Sultan Syahrir, who was kidnapped by radical Indonesian Republicans in 46. He did not come to the Netherlands in 51 as a KNIL soldier, but as a member of the music band Suara Maluku band. He built up his career and his life in the Netherlands and always stayed loyal to his passion, music. Sadly enough, he passed away a year ago. And the last person I would like to introduce is my own grandfather. That's another example. A KNIL sergeant who did not come to the Netherlands in 51 because he was already retired. And he had moved to Surabaya after his retirement in the 50s. He lived there in a large house on Jalan Taman Manyangkara. You see, the world is smaller than you might think. First of all, there's a small video footage on the arrival of the transport with the ship Atlantis, which departed from Surabaya on February 21, 1951, and arrived in Rotterdam on March 23. So this was a small video footage of 70 years ago, the arrival of one of the transport ships to the Netherlands. Looking for the reason why a group of Moluccans came to the Netherlands, we have to take into account the relation between the Netherlands and the Moluccas. The relationship between the Netherlands and the Moluccas dates back to around 1600. In search of the popular cloves and nutmeg, the Dutch trading company, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, came to the Moluccas. There they expelled the Portuguese and other European economic competitors and concluded contracts with the local population who promised to sell the spices exclusively to them. However, the local population regularly sold the spices to the highest bidder. The VOC responded with violence. On Banda, the VOC and Jan Pieterszoon Koen committed a genocide in 1621 by killing almost the entire population of Banda. The so-called Ambonese Wars finally ended in 1656 with a victory and the spice monopoly for the VOC. The production area for the spices was now limited by the VOC. Cloves on Ambon Lease and nutmeg and maize on the Banda Islands. If plants were found outside this area, these were destroyed and often the village was burned to the ground. The population was forced to move from the mountains to the beach so that they could be better controlled by the VOC. And in addition, they were forced to manage the cultivation of spices. The spice monopoly was not abolished until the 19th century. And with the VOC also, the Protestant religion came to the Moluccas. In the first half of the 20th century, the relationship between the Netherlands and the Moluccas was often described as Ambon loyal through the centuries, Ambon door de eeuwen trouw. If Moluccan soldiers are considered here, then the famous Kapitein Jonker must be mentioned, a nobleman from Manipa, who already in the 17th century fought with great success in favor of the VOC. But in 1817, part of the population of the Central Moluccas revolted against the Dutch, who after the two short British interim administrations wanted to take over business again. So the leader of the uprising, Thomas Matulesi, alias Patimura, fought against the Dutch. It was not until the end of the 19th century that more and more Moluccans enlisted as soldiers in the colonial army. This mainly concerned Christian Ambonese. Moluccan Muslims were left aside by the colonial government. At the end of the 19th century, the colonial policy of the Netherlands in the Indies changed following the grabbing for colonies by European countries such as England, Germany, and France. The Netherlands also followed the colonial expansion from Sabang to Merauke, it was said. The entire Indies archipelago had to be brought under Dutch control. The Aceh War from 1873 till 1914 is a good marker of this expansion, as is the conquest of Lombok and various principalities in Bali around the same time. The colonial government needed military personnel for this expansion. In recruiting military personnel, she focused specifically on Christian population groups in East Indonesia, Ambonese, Manadonese, Timorese, and they had the reputation of being loyal to the Christian Dutch, and they were known as good fighters. Early in the 19th century, the colonial government had held special recruitment campaigns among Moluccans. However, this hardly produced any results. In 1865, there were only 984 Ambonese among the 27,000 Knil soldiers. At the end of the 19th century, however, the Moluccan candidates were given more privileges than the other Indonesian military. They received a higher entrance fee and salary. They received shoes, bread for breakfast like the Dutch, and better educational opportunities for their children in the Tangsi, the military base. In 1917, the number of Moluccan soldiers in the CNIL had risen to 3,500 men. After a specific area was brought under actual Dutch control, the local population had to be governed, to be administered. The government also focused on Christian Moluccans as administrators, civil servants. This all gradually created a special bond between the Netherlands and a group of Christian Moluccans. Ambon's loyalty to the Netherlands through the century, as I already told you, Ambon door de eeuwen trouw, was the slogan. And as a result, Moluccan communities arose throughout the Indonesian archipelago. During the Second World War and after the proclamation of the Republic of Indonesia by Sukarno and Hatta in 1945, during the decolonization war, the Zaman Revolutie until 1949, many Moluccans supported the Indonesian Republicans, but also many Moluccan CNIL soldiers showed themselves to be loyal defenders of Dutch colonial interests. On December 27, 1949, the Netherlands, under international political pressure, transferred sovereignty to the United States of Indonesia, the RIS, Republik Indonesia Serikat. A federation of 7 states, including the Republic Indonesia of Sukarno and Hatta on parts of Java and Sumatra. And another is the state of East Indonesia, Negara Indonesia Timur, the NIT. And this NIT included a number of sub-states, daerah, including the daerah of South Maluku. At that time, the CNIL consisted of approximately 65,000 soldiers. Now, with the transfer of the sovereignty, it was decided that the CNIL would be disbanded on July 26, 1950. The Moluccan CNIL soldiers had to choose or to be demobilized at the place of their choice within Indonesia, or make the transfer to the APRIS, the Army of the United States of Indonesia. And at the beginning of 1950, about 1,000 Moluccan soldiers transferred to the Indonesian Army. For the majority of the Moluccan CNIL soldiers, the transition to the former enemy was a difficult step. Negotiations about the transfer were still in full swing when the Republic Maluku Selatan, the RMS, was proclaimed in Ambon on April the 25th, 1950. Most Moluccan soldiers then sided with the RMS and wanted to be demobilized on Ambon, but the government of Indonesia gave not permission for this. On the basis of the agreements with Indonesia, the Netherlands needed an agreement with the Indonesian government about the place of demobilization of the former CNIL soldiers. When Ambon was unacceptable to Indonesia, most soldiers chose Dutch New Guinea. The fact that this area remained Dutch and bordered on the Moluccas played a major role in this, but that was another reason for Indonesia to be against this option. As a result, the intended demobilization was still delayed. That is why the Moluccan CNIL soldiers were temporarily included in the Dutch Royal Army just before the closure of the CNIL on July the 26th, 1950. It was an emergency solution pending a definite demobilization. Due to the temporary KL status, the Moluccan soldiers remained under the political responsibility of the Netherlands and subject to Dutch military discipline. When the dissolution of the CNIL on July 26, 1950, about 16,700 men were still in service. About 26,000 transferred to the Indonesian Army. More than 70,000 demobilized at the place of their choice, and more than 3,000 eventually went to the Netherlands. About 1,600 Moluccan soldiers were on Ambon, where they were fired because their support for the RMS. In the course of 1950, tense situations had arisen in and around the various encampments where the Moluccan soldiers and their families stayed. The Dutch military authorities ordered that all Moluccan soldiers and their families were to be transferred to 5 large transit camps on Java, nearly 4,000 soldiers with their families. At the end of 1950, there were 3,750 Moluccans ex-KNIL soldiers waiting for their repatriation to Ambon. The Dutch government found that it could no longer be delayed before demobilizing the Moluccan soldiers. Fear of a foreign criticism and a possible deterioration of relations with Indonesia played a significant, important role in this. But the Dutch government was also afraid of criticism in its own country, because as long as a solution was not forthcoming, Dutch conscripts still had to serve in Indonesia, because their role was to act as a buffer between the Moluccan soldiers and their hostile Indonesian environment on Java. The government therefore considered demobilization of the Moluccans in Java contrary to the KNIL rules, but this resolution met with resistance. Since August 1950, a delegation of Moluccan soldiers had been in the Netherlands, led by Sergeant Major Apono. This delegation represented the interests of former Moluccan KNIL soldiers and started proceedings against the Dutch states to prevent demobilization on Java. The judge forbade the Dutch government to abandon its soldiers against their will in the area of a country hostile to them. This also meant that demobilization on Java was cancelled. To get out of the deadlock, the Dutch government decided to temporarily bring the Moluccan soldiers to the Netherlands. Then the Dutch conscript on Java could finally come home again. The Moluccan soldiers in the transit camps were ordered to choose from the following options: transfer to the Indonesian army, demobilization on Java, or a temporary transfer to the Netherlands. In February 51, the Moluccan soldiers had to choose from these 3 options. They had already rejected the transition to the Indonesian army, just like the demobilization on Java. In fact, there was no real choice, one can say. For this reason, the soldiers in the camps initially refused to comment on the options offered. If they did not make a choice, they would have to embark on a service order to the Netherlands. The refusal to make a choice changed somewhat when the Moluccan delegation in the Netherlands, the Pono delegation, announced on 16 February 51 that sending to the Netherlands had to be agreed. For many Moluccans, this was a reason to opt for the Netherlands. Some Dutch commanders convinced doubters by ordering them to board. From February to May 51, about 12,500 Moluccans, about 3,500 KNIL soldiers, embarked to the Netherlands. In addition to the soldiers and their families, this also included Moluccan personnel from the Royal Netherlands Navy, policemen from the former state of East Indonesia, civilians, and stowaways. In the first half of 51, 12 transports with Moluccans came to the Netherlands. The group consisted of 3,795 men, almost 3,000 women, and more than 6,000 children. More than 90% of them were Protestant and came from the Central Moluccas. About 5% was Catholic, mainly from the Kai and Tanimba Islands, and about 2% were Muslim. Well, if you're a bit confused on this matter of demobilization and repatriation, you probably are not alone. It was a hectic and a very confusing time. And that brings me to the second part, the Netherlands. Upon arrival in the Netherlands, the Moluccan soldiers were told that they have been discharged from military service. This was a great disappointment for them, as their discharge could only officially take place after their arrival at the place of repatriation. The method of discharge was also disappointing. A printed stencil with only the name, army number, and date written in pen. This testified to an impersonal, massive, and cold farewell. Protest and a subsequent lawsuit against the state to challenge the dismissal ultimately failed. The stay of the Molochen group in the Netherlands was also only temporary, only for a few months, so it was believed. The Moluccans were housed in so-called Ambonese camps, woonorde, which consisted of monasteries, country houses, holiday resorts, and former German concentration camps from the Second World War, such as Westerbork, Schattenberg, and Vught Lunette. The care for the Moluccans were organized by the Dutch government. Food was provided by a central kitchen. Initially, work for the Moluccans was discouraged. Everyone received pocket money of 2 or 3 guilders every week. The children went to school in the residence itself, or in the case of a small residence, a school in the neighborhood. At the end of 1952, the care for the Moluccans came into the hands of a special commissariat, Ambonese Zorg, the CAZ. As a representative of the Dutch government, this commissariat arranged everything for the Moluccans, such as food, clothing, and choice of school. The residents of the residential areas were represented at the commissariat by local Moluccan camp councils. To give you an impression of the conditions in these residential areas, in these camps, I'll show you a number of photos of Camp Lunette, which was a former concentration camp in the Second World War. And these photos are from the 1950s. This is an aerial view of the Camp Lunette in the south of the Netherlands. Barracks, as you can see. There's a central room where you can wash your stuff. This is one of the rooms for a family. Mind you, this is all 51. Small room. And these are the camps and residential areas for the Moluccans in the Netherlands. As you can see, almost numbers 90. As time passed and there was no immediate prospect of a direct return to the Indies, to Indonesia, the government believed that the Moluccans themselves should contribute more to their own livelihood. In 1956, the self-care scheme was introduced. In principle, people now had to provide for their own livelihood. For example, the private kitchen replaced the central kitchen. The Moluccans were fiercely protesting against this self-care scheme because they believed that the Dutch government was responsible for their care until they were repatriated in the Dutch East Indies, in Indonesia, in the Moluccas. The protests were echoed in numerous demonstrations and other actions. Ultimately, they had no choice but to accept the new scheme. As the years passed on and a return of the Moluccans in the short term became increasingly distant, the government decided at the end of the 50s that the Moluccan community must become more absorbed in Dutch society. The Moluccans had to move from the woonorde, the camps, to new housing. These residential areas were not like the camps outside the built-up area, but in villages and towns itself. In this way, more contact between Moluccans and the Dutch would be encouraged. The first Moluccan residential area was completed in 1960, and more than 60 residential areas would follow. The closure of the camps did not always go without a struggle, and it also took much longer than anticipated. Some Moluccans were opposed to moving to a stone house. because they consider it as a denial of their temporary nature, of the temporary nature of their stay in the Netherlands. For example, the Lunette camp was only demolished in 1902, and the new residential area completed in 1993. In most cases, the residential areas were located near the former camps. Some proximity to work played a role. The Molochen residential areas are the center of the Molochen community. From the beginning of their stay in the Netherlands, most of the Molochans supported the RMS. Since 1951, every effort has been made to obtain support for the RMS from, for example, the Dutch government. Numerous peaceful demonstrations were organized without any positive result. From 1966 onwards, the campaigns for support of the RMS became harder. After the execution of the previously imprisoned RMS President Sukarno in Indonesia in 1966, an RMS government in exile was established in the Netherlands on April 12, 1966, with Ingenieur Manusama as a new president. Several weeks later, Nyonya Sukarno, the widow of the executed RMS president, came to the Netherlands. The execution of Sukarno in the Netherlands led to arson at the Indonesian embassy in The Hague. This was the first violent action by Molochen youth in the Netherlands. In the years that followed, more actions followed in the fight for a free RMS. The best known are the occupation of the residence of the Indonesian ambassador in Wassenaar in 1970. When a visit by the Indonesian President Suharto to the Netherlands was on the agenda, 33 Moluccans occupied the official residence of the Indonesian ambassador in Wassenaar. The group demanded that the Dutch government would animate a conversation between RMS President Manusama and the Indonesian President Suharto. The group eventually surrendered after the Dutch government agreed to meet with President Manusama. Dissatisfaction rose among Molochen youth as a result of the passive attitude of the Dutch government towards the RMS and the disappointed concrete results of the RMS leadership. Next to this, one of the Dutch ministers stated at that time that the RMS was an illusion. What followed were a series of Molochen violent actions. First in December 1975, the hijacking of a train at Wijster and the occupation of the Indonesian consulate in Amsterdam. Followed in May 1977 by the hijack of another train at the Punt and the occupation of a primary school in Bovensmilde. The last violent action took place in 1978, the occupation of the provincial house in Assen. The last hostage meant the end of violence as an option for support for the RMS. A public discussion started within the Molochen community about the RMS ideal. RMS executives made orientation trips to the Molochans, something that had hardly been possible before. Numerous Molochen political organizations were emerging that framed the RMS struggle in a new political context. The Molochen political action left deep traces in Dutch and Molochen society. In the eyes of the Dutch government, the violence was mainly an expression of the dissatisfaction with the poor position of Molochans in Dutch society. That is why in the 70s and 80s, measures were taken to tackle problems in the social field and national Molochen institutions were made possible. On the other side, much of the Molochen society saw the action as an expression of frustration at the lack of result in the fight for a free RMS. Around 1980, conflicts arose between the Dutch government and the Molochen community in the Netherlands in the field of housing, related to the transfer of ownership of part of the Molochen housing from the Dutch state, in particular from the royal domains, to housing corporations. Because the mutual understanding between the Dutch government and the Moluccan community has been bad for some times, also as a result of the hostage-taking actions in the 70s, negotiations are started between the government and the so-called Badan Persatuan, the largest Moluccan interest group. In 1986, they succeeded in taking a step towards restoring the mutual relationship of trust. On behalf of the Dutch government and the Badan Persatuan, respectively Dutch Prime Minister Lubbers and Chairman Referent Metiari, signed the so-called Joint Declaration, also known as the Lubbers-Metiari Agreement. It was agreed that the first generation of Moluccans would receive an honorary medal for their services rendered, the so-called Rietkerk Medal, and an annual sum of 2,000 guilders, the so-called Rietkerk benefit, named after the Minister of the Interior, who was also responsible for the minorities policy, Koos Rietkerk. A consequence of the joint declaration was also that the Dutch government was donating a living monument to the Moluccan community in the Netherlands. That was the Moluccan Historical Museum in Utrecht. The package of measures also included a joint approach to unemployment and housing problems. In 1990, the 1,000 Jobs Plan was launched, intended to create 1,000 jobs for unemployed Moluccan youth. Moreover, in the field of education, attention was paid to the own language and culture. After the special attention of the Dutch government in the 1980s, the Moluccan population group received less and less attention in the 90s. During this period, it was clear that the Moluccan community in the Netherlands was struggling with various socio-economic problems such as unemployment, poor education, and the use of hard drugs. Moreover, around the year 2000, it appeared that the third generation of Moluccans were also doing less well than was thought and expected. For example, a relative backwardness was still observed in the field of education. The ideal of an independent republic of the South Moluccas was still alive in many of them. The trip to the Moluccas, which became more and more common from the 80s, was in their eyes more and more a holiday trip instead of going home of older Moluccans. Within the Moluccan community, the term temporary stay was increasingly being exchanged for permanent residence. The RMS was also no longer all-determining. Integration into the Dutch society was clearly starting to take off. The Moluccan community felt closely involved in the suffering during the civil war in the Moluccas from 1999 to 2003. Almost every Moluccan contributed to human aid actions and projects. Another consequence was that every Moluccan could be actively involved with the Moluccas without getting a political stigma of cooperating with Indonesia, the enemy of the RMS. From 1951 onwards, the Moluccan community in general considered every fellow Moluccan who did not support the RMS was an enemy. Every reference to Indonesia was suspicious. Indonesia was banned. The Moluccan community in the Netherlands, one can say, isolated themselves from the people in the Moluccas and Indonesia. From the 80s on, some people went on a holiday. From around 2000, it became more common to be involved with the Moluccas and Indonesia. Looking back at the history of Moluccans and that of the Netherlands, one can say that these histories are largely intertwined. From the start of their stay in the Netherlands until the 80s, three issues were dominating the Moluccan community. First, the cold discharge from the military service upon arrival in the Netherlands. Secondly, a return to the Moluccas. Three, the political recognition of the RMS. The Molochen identity was closely related to the RMS ideal. From the 1980s on, integration really started off. The term temporary stay was replaced by permanent residence. Till the 1990s, political demonstration in favor of the RMS rallied thousands of supporters. Nowadays, a few hundred or some tens, with an exception during the yearly commemoration of the proclamation of the RMS on April 25. National Molochen organizations are gone. What remains is the individual bond of Moluccans in the Netherlands with the village of origin in the Moluccas. So almost every Moluccan is a member of Kumpulan. Well, today, as I told you, this year we commemorate a history of 70 years Moluccans in the Netherlands. There was quite some attention in the Dutch media for this history. There were podcasts and live streams on the internet, as for instance, the one by the Dutch National Archive on March 21, called The Erfenis, The Heritage, where several guests presented a personal, different perspective on the history of Moluccans in the Netherlands. There was also a documentary on Dutch national TV on 70 years Moluccans in the Netherlands. The documentary was made by a Dutch historian, Koen Verbraak, who also used the interviews from the documentary for his book, what he published, called The Moluccans. The overall reaction of the Dutch public was one of ignorance. I did not know anything of this history. I feel ashamed about the way we received the Moluccans in the Netherlands, was often heard. Ladies and gentlemen, I round up my lecture. Looking forward, history can be seen as a collection of perspectives. The Moluccan community in the Netherlands is a diverse one. The diversity concerns Moluccans with a canal, a naval, or a civil servant background. The first generation of Moluccans can be divided in those who came from the villages in the Moluccas and those who are born and raised outside the Moluccas because their father was stationed there as a canal soldier or civil servant. There are Moluccans from the central Moluccas, Ambon Lease, from the southeast Moluccas, from Seram, Buru, and Ternate. And the diversity also is presented in religion because the majority is Christian, but there is also a minority of Muslims. There are also those who support the RMS and those who returned to Indonesia in the 50s or accept the Moluccas as a political part of Indonesia. There's one similarity among the Moluccans in the Netherlands. The first generation came to the Netherlands because they were closely linked to Dutch colonial interests in the Netherlands Indies. They came for a temporary stay, which became a permanent residence. It's clear that Moluccans after 70 years in the Netherlands found their future in the Netherlands. Photographer Ed Letemia commemorated 70 years in the Netherlands by publishing a book earlier this year with 70 artistic photographs of Moluccan role models with their stories of success in the Netherlands.
Excuse me,
ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Pak Ron Habibu, for your fascinating presentation. From your presentation, we can understand how the situation of the Moluccans as ethnic group with which has close ties to the Dutch government or military was enforced to face political situation at the time, and they forced to move to the Netherlands along with their families into the Netherlands, a cold area, and I think it is not as comfortable as it is now in terms of availability of heating technology, especially during the winter. No wonder that they really want to return to Indonesia, which has tropical climate, which is warmer than the Netherlands. And some of them even protested openly to end hijack trains. Yeah. And of course, the problem faced were not only that, but it also include the socio-economic and cultural problems that faced by the Moluccans in the Netherlands. I just want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions or comments to Pak Ron Habibu's presentation. So please raise your hand, or you can write in chat room. Oh, okay. Oh, you have several questions, Pak Ron?
Yeah.
The first is from Hanzala. Before I want to appreciate the discussion about the presentation that you delivered, which is very good, so that we have a detailed insight into Moluccan history in the Netherlands. Just short time for me to be able to deepen my knowledge. So my question is there a return of Dutch Moluccans to Indonesia?
Well, thank you for this question, Anzala. I don't think that we're talking about the fifth generation of the third, fourth, and fifth generation in the Netherlands. I don't think that the third and later generations will return to Indonesia then only for a vacation or a meeting with their relatives. Their future is also here. And what I notice is that if we talk about the how do you say that, the origin, the first and second generation talk about like for instance the family, a person in Ambon as a stem holder of the family. But the third and later generation often speak on the stem holder. No, not the stem holder. The initial person who is on the basis of the family history is their grandfather who came to the Netherlands. So that represented the idea that they stay in the Netherlands. They only go back to Indonesia for a vacation. But next to that, there are still a lot of young Moluccans who are involved in all kinds of projects to attribute to the prosperous economy in the Moluccas. And for instance, in in all kinds of projects. So no, they are not going back to Indonesia then only for a vacation.
Okay, thank you, Baran. And the second question addressed to you is about the train hijacking. What is the condition of the Molochen at that time?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because we, as a community, did not expect these actions. And at that time, if you are in support of the RMS or not, we all knew that these youngsters did not act for their own benefit, but for the community. So a lot of the hijackers of the last hijacking were killed, and supporters of the RMS or not supporters of the RMS, we all were followed the funeral of the hijackers, because we all knew that they were killed not for their own benefit, but they were acting for the community as a whole. At that time, the situation was strictly the Dutch society and the Molochen society, because they were all Molochen residential areas. They were like camps, and they were opposite to the Dutch society. Well, we were all surprised by it. And after a few actions, we knew that, what we tried to gain, and that is support from the Dutch government for the NMS, was not possible. So there was a reorientation on the struggle for the NMS.
Okay, and the third question related to the social mobility of the Molochen in the Netherlands. Is there any effort by the Dutch government to assimilate the Moluccans in the Netherlands?
Yes, especially because of the hijackings, the relationship between the Dutch government and the Molochen society in the Netherlands was destroyed. One can say was destroyed. There were some actions to bring back everything together, and the Dutch government came with social with all kinds of regulations in order to restore the social economic problems within the Molochen community. And for instance, unemployment. As for the problem of the drugs, there were national Molochen organization who tried to fix that problem. That the organization was called Chandu. So, but now one can say that at first, the first generation was quite. They were all almost everyone was a soldier. Nowadays, we have a very mixed population. People who are going to the who follow university education, all kinds of social elements are now integrated into communities. So I think that nowadays we're facing a more positive future.
Okay, thank you, Baron. I just want to give opportunity for the audience, to raise hand, to ask orally. I see UD Prasetyo, maybe one of our colleagues from Sidoarjo. Do you have any question for Pak Ron, Pak UD? Oh, it's now the evening prayer, maybe he's praying for Maghrib. Okay, and the last question, I think, from Sangwa Cahyo. From 1999 to 2003, there was a civil war in the Maluku settlements in the Netherlands. My question is, were there any steps taken by the Dutch government at the time and the Indonesian government at the time to resolve this conflict?
As far as I know, the Dutch government did not make any attempt to resolve the conflict, but what they did do is that they supported all kinds of actions and programs which emerged from the Molochen society to help the people over there to rebuild the villages and to rebuild the economic situation and so on. So there was no really direct action by the Dutch government, but they supported with money all kinds of programs to rebuild the economy and the Molochen society. But there was no action to resolve the problem by the Dutch government. No, not at all.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ron. Maybe Pak Sarkawi would like to say something to Pak Ron.
Oh, I have a question to.
Okay, Pak Suryadi, yeah, please.
Bung Ron, do you have a statistical data about the marriage among the Moluccans? I mean, how many percent they make interracial marriage with Dutch partner? Yeah.
No, I don't. There's one problem. How do you register a person as a Molochen? There are a lot of mixed marriages with the Dutch, but do the people self-identify themselves as a Molochen or not? Well, that's very difficult. There's a recent research by the Central Bureau of Statistics here in the Netherlands, which estimates the Molochen community at around 70,000 Moloccans. But there are some critical voices because the people from the Moluccans from New Guinea, for instance, who came to the Netherlands in 62 and 63, they were not involved in that research. And then again, another thing is, who is a Moluccan? You know, I know that the attempts of the Dutch government to get some insight on the Moluccan community, the numbers in the 80s and the 90s was by self-identification. A lot of people did not follow this self-identification, so it still is, well, a bit vague. I know that in the 80s there was something like, if you have one grandparent who was born in Indonesia or in the Moluccas, then you were considered to be a Moluccan. But well, that's a long time ago. So it's very difficult. But as I know, there are a lot of mixed marriages, not only by the Dutch, because there are a lot of people from all kinds of states entering the Netherlands. So there are a lot of mixed marriages with people from Suriname as well. So yeah, it's mixing.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, not only from citizenship perspective, but do you think in the 6th or 7th next generation, the Moluccans in more whiter? And now I still can identify Ron from Moluccans because your skin. But what will happen in the next 2 or 3 generations?
Yeah, well, I don't know actually, but what I see is that some people who have only one grandparent from the Moluccas, who are white and a Dutch father, so their family name is also Dutch, they themselves, not all, but some, consider themselves as Moluccan. Don't say that they're Dutch. No, they're not happy with that. They are Moluccan. They identify themselves as Moluccan. And I myself are surprised sometimes to meet some youngsters who I don't recognize as a Moluccan, but as a Dutch, and who identified him or herself as a Moluccan. So I don't know where it leads to. But yeah, probably we're all, as a community, we will grow lighter skin, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, but I think that's less important, because the most important thing is the ethnic identification and your self-identification. And if you're lighter or darker or what, yeah, no, that's less important, as we see or make a comparison with, for example, the Jews in the world. There are black Jews, white Jews, yellow Jews, and so on. So, well, we're still going into the future, and we're facing a good time and a mixed time.
Okay, agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, intermarriage seems to be an interesting issue. For most Indonesians, usually they struggle to have light skin, fair
Yeah,
skin.
yeah.
But it
Yeah.
turns out that the Mollucans are afraid of losing their Moluccan identity with the changing of their skin. Okay, I think we have to stop right now. Maybe Pak Sarugay would like to say something to end up this meeting because we haven't opened this discussion.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Joni, Pak Ron dan Pak Suryadi. Thank you very much for lecturing today. So very, very interesting, I think. And I think next year, Pak Joni, we can arrange a lecture today. Next year, I mean, we have a lot of time to make a special lecture from Pak Suryadi and Pak Ron Habibu. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you, Pak Joni.
Oh, thank you, Pak Sakawi. I hope we can have time for discussion for next year or next opportunity. And thank you so much, Pak Suryadi and Pak Ron Habibu and everyone in this room. Thank you. So I hope we can learn from everything we have here, we have discussed in this seminars. And thank you once again, and see you next year or in every, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Pak Suryadi, Pak Ron.
Happy New Year in
Last
advance.
point, yeah.
Yes.
Prettige kerstdagen en nieuwjaar.
Ja,
Ja.
dank u wel. Ja, sama-sama ya.
Ya,
Sama-sama.
heel gezond.
Ya, makasih ya.
Ya, oke. Oke, terima kasih semua. Selamat
Sampai
sore.
bertemu. Yuk.
Saya mohon dulu karena mau mengajar.
Ya, terima kasih Pak.
Ya, Pak Suryadi, ini saya juga
Terima
mau
kasih,
ada
Pak.
kelas nih.